to It's Not Normal, the podcast, episode 24. In this week's episode, I want to talk about what it's like when you find yourself in the position of having to tell someone in your life the truth about your narcissistic parent. I ran into an old teacher of mine a few days ago, someone who knew my parent when I was in school. And like most people in my life up until recently, they had thought of them very positively. Like they were very charismatic, very involved. And on the surface, it appeared that we had a really great relationship. The thing about emotional abuse, I just kind of want to dive right into it, is that it's so easily hidden. I think especially when you're dealing with a parent-child relationship, because there's sort of an inherent power dynamic that's involved. You're so impressionable as a child, and the narrative for those really early formative years of our lives is to listen to our parents, to trust adults, to respect adults because they know better than we do. And I think a lot of the manipulative behaviors that you might encounter when you're dealing with a narcissistic parent are very ambiguous. Control disguised as involvement. You might have a parent who always volunteers their time or offers to coach a sports team. And on the surface, I think these actions are admirable. This person appears to be very generous, very kind. They're offering up their time and energy to maybe make these things happen for their kids. And I think in turn, sometimes the children of these parents are made to feel like they're so lucky for having a mom or dad who shows up for them and supports them and is willing to donate so much of their time and attention. And yet I think when you sort of take a step back, granted, there are undoubtedly parents out there who show up and support their kids for the right reasons. They communicate with them, they view them as their own person, and respect their autonomy and their boundaries. But when you're dealing with a narcissistic parent where there are other manipulative behaviors that are present, I think sometimes that over-involvement is a way for the parent to ensure that their child always feels their presence. And when you think back to when you were younger, if you were just hanging out with a group of friends, a group of kids your age, naturally, you're going to act a little bit differently than if you were being supervised by a teacher or a parent. You might, in those cases, be on your best behavior. You might be thinking twice about the things that you say or do. And yet I think it's so important for development, both personally and socially, to have the opportunity to just be around kids your age, to not always feel like mom or dad is watching and listening to every little thing that you say and watching every little thing that you do. I think that time is really crucial for developing that self-trust and that sense of identity. And I think sometimes when you have a parent who is so overly involved in their child's life, in all aspects of their life, it can feel really suffocating. Criticism, even, I think sometimes can be so easily disguised or masked as encouragement, where, maybe you've got an overachieving child, right? And I think that's the case with a lot of children of narcissistic parents, which is another one of those reasons that it can be so hard to spot what's actually going on behind the scenes. You might have an overachieving child who's getting really great grades, or maybe they're really great in sports. And so you don't necessarily think anything of it. You've got a parent who's encouraging publicly, right? They're always pushing their child to do their best, to be their best, to excel, which again, on the surface, can be perceived as a really positive thing. Like they're just encouraging their child to do the best that they can do. And yet that support that is seen publicly isn't always the same privately. And I think that is when we get into some muddier waters where that encouragement can start to lean a bit more towards criticism. I think there's also an element of comparison that comes into play here. I think it's really common for a lot of adult children of narcissistic parents to constantly feel like they're not good enough. Like we are not good enough simply for who we are and for trying our best. If we don't do things perfectly, then that's just not good enough. And I think sometimes when you're dealing with a parent like this, They might compare you to other kids your age whose behavior or performance is more favorable to them. Or even worse, they might constantly compare you to this idealized version of you that they've created in their heads. And those expectations you will never meet or exceed because just like everyone else, you're human and you're flawed. And so you can exist in this environment where you feel like you're constantly being compared, like nothing you do is ever good enough. And yet on the surface, to everyone else on the outside, it just appears that your parent is showing up and they're pushing you. They're pushing you to do your best. And that can be really confusing. I think when the actions, especially publicly, aren't particularly alarming, they don't necessarily raise any red flags. Again, especially when you're dealing maybe with an overachieving child. I think if a child's performance is suffering in school, or if they play sports and they're really not doing well, that I think can sometimes be a bit more cause for concern because there's more clearly sort of a correlation between not performing and something being wrong in someone's personal life. Whereas if you've got a child who's excelling, who's doing really well, who comes across as very mature, even capable of holding conversations with adults and teachers, they're very respectful, you don't even think to question most of the time that anything is wrong because everything seems fine or above average even. And so it's not until you look into the motive, sort of I think the incentive behind a lot of these actions, that you can start to determine whether or not these actions are actually healthy or unhealthy. And I think that is one of the reasons that narcissistic parents and emotional abuse in general is so easily camouflaged. So I run into this teacher a few days ago, and I was thrilled to run into him. He was a really great teacher of mine. He was one of those teachers that felt more like a friend or a mentor than a real authority figure. His class always felt very open for real conversation. It didn't feel like we were sticking to any one particular curriculum. It was sort of open-ended. And I think the subject that he taught was very much entwined with his life and who he is as a person, which I think most often is when students get the best experience in a classroom. When you're being taught a subject by someone who is truly passionate about it, rather than maybe they've just learned about it in books, they've never actually put these things into practice in their own personal life. I think that is when you can develop that deeper understanding and passion for a subject. So I was so happy to run into him, and we were chatting for probably 40 minutes, almost an hour. And as the conversation was coming to a close, just very casually, he asked, "The folks are good?" And in that moment, I didn't know what to say. But the first thing that came out of my mouth was, "Oh, yeah, they're good. They're doing well." And this is always a strange position to find yourself in, especially if your relationship with your parent has drastically changed since you've last seen this person. And I think it depends a lot on who you're talking to also. The people in my life that I'm close to, that I see often, know the situation, and the people that I see occasionally don't. I think sometimes when you run into a friendly face in public, someone that you don't see too often, it's not always the time or place to kind of get into the nitty-gritty of your personal life. But this teacher and I had stayed in touch briefly here and there, and I always felt like we just had sort of this mutual respect and understanding for one another, like we were on the same wavelength as creatives or just as people. And I think he sensed the hesitation in my answer because, again, I didn't want to say what I said, and yet I felt like that was sort of my default answer. That was the easy out without having to get into any of this. But in that moment, I sort of realized another responsibility that is so often put on the shoulders of children of narcissistic parents. And that is making the decision to lie and sort of maintain this image, this facade, to lie on behalf of your narcissistic parent when someone in your life asks about them, or to be honest and tell the truth. And it's not a fun position to be in. I felt like I was telling someone Santa wasn't real. I think, in giving an honest answer and saying, I really don't know how they're doing because I haven't spoken to them in the last 10 months or so since I've gotten married. All I was doing in that was giving an honest answer to a very innocent question. And yet, in a lot of ways, I sort of felt like I was lifting the veil for this other person. I was kind of turning the lights on and maybe pulling the rug out from under them a little bit, because it's always shocking when you find out that someone isn't who they say they are or is something other than what you believe them to be. And I think sometimes that experience or that feeling can be intensified when you're dealing with a narcissistic person, because they tend to be so over the top, kind and generous and positive that it's hard to imagine them being anything different, never mind on the completely other end of the spectrum as a master manipulator. I think also when you find yourself in a situation like this, there's the obvious element of feeling like you're sort of trauma dumping on this person. And that can be a difficult feeling to navigate because you want to be honest with them. You want to give them an honest answer, but you also, in the same breath, don't want to burden them with some really heavy information. But that's what it is. I think no matter how brief or succinct you try to make that statement, the nature of it is heavy. It's sort of inevitable. I'm not speaking to my parents anymore. It sort of lends itself to a lot of other questions. But then also, I think depending on who it is you're talking to, what your relationship is like with that person, and what their relationship is or was with your narcissistic parent, you also run the risk of not being believed. And that kind of anxiety, I think, sometimes can get in the way. You don't want to be perceived as ungrateful or like a brat who's just complaining about their parents. I think, again, that narrative is so common, right? That the title of mom and dad sort of erases a lot of the negativity or the manipulative behaviors that so many of us endured. And I think speaking out, even I have received comments across different forms of social media from people who don't fully understand the effects of being raised by a narcissistic parent on your mental health. I don't think some of these people have ever encountered a narcissistic person, at least not knowingly. And so I think on the surface, I come across to some people as just some kid who's entitled, ungrateful, spoiled, and I'm just talking shit on my parents. And what's really upsetting about that is, for so long, I think so many of us were really pressured to keep things quiet, to never speak negatively about anything. And I think our parents were always sort of given the benefit of the doubt, right? But now, having the courage, finding the courage to speak out and to speak honestly about your own life experience can be really difficult, especially when it involves a relationship so close to you as your relationship with your parents. And so that's never a fun feeling, to feel like you want to be honest with a person, but also wondering whether or not they're going to believe you, or in you saying that, will their perception of you change? When you're dealing with someone, though, who really understands you and hears where you're coming from, what you say can really drastically change their opinion of your parent. And so, you can leave that conversation, I know I did, feeling like you just kind of dropped a bomb on that person, kind of pulled the rug out from under them, because up until that point, up until they asked that question, they had one particular idea of who your parent was, right? They were a good person, they were kind, they were involved, and that was that. But now, all of a sudden, there's so much more to it. And they find out that this person is not really who they thought they were. And their behavior has drastically impacted my life and our relationship. So in being honest, now that's something new that this other person has to process. And in that moment, when I made the decision to just be honest and tell the truth, instead of just lying and, letting the conversation come and go, I couldn't help but feel like this was just another responsibility to add to the laundry list of things that children of narcissistic parents have to do. This weight that so many of us shoulder, even though it is not ours to carry. Because so many emotionally immature parents, narcissistic parents, live within this diluted version of reality that they have created for themselves, where they are the heroes and we are the villains. I think telling the truth and feeling comfortable speaking honestly about your life experience is a really important step in the healing process. I think there's a certain level of self-awareness that needs to be developed before you can honestly and accurately speak about a lot of things that maybe you endured earlier in your life. I was completely naive to a lot of the toxic behaviors that I was surrounded by for much of my childhood until recently. And so I wouldn't have been able to really realize on my own how those things had impacted me, and I definitely wouldn't have been able to communicate that to another person. And so I think once you've developed that level of self-awareness and you've started to realize your trauma, you're sort of taking steps to reclaim your narrative. You're learning to develop that self-trust and to validate your own life experience and your emotions. That is massively important, I think, in starting to answer those very crucial fundamental questions. Who am I? Why am I the way that I am? And how can I move forward in a really healthy, positive way so that I can start to take steps to create the life that I want to live, free from everything that came before, all of that toxicity? How can I start to let that go? And I think answering those questions can help you to realize that you no longer have to maintain this facade that for so long you were pressured to maintain. You don't have to not speak about things that you endured throughout your childhood for the sake of preserving someone else's image. You no longer have to keep your narcissistic parents' secrets. That's not your responsibility. Your main responsibility now is to yourself, whatever that looks like. And I think for a lot of adult children of narcissistic parents, that responsibility to ourselves is learning who we are and learning to develop our self-trust, to not gaslight ourselves, to look back and to stare a lot of these experiences right in the face and to understand how unhealthy they were and how they might have informed some of our decisions, our actions, our reactions, even into adulthood, into other relationships in our lives. And so once you've gotten there and you can start to let other people in your inner circle in, you can continue to take those steps in healing. And letting go of all of that, I think realizing that, speaking openly about it can be very freeing because you're reminding yourself that you are your own person and that your experience, your emotions are just as valid as anyone else's. And while it can be freeing, I think, to let go of a lot of that, it can also be really overwhelming. One, because a lot of these questions that you were sort of meant to answer throughout your childhood or maybe your teenage years, this development of self-trust and identity that I think typically takes place over an extended period of time, you're maybe showing up to these questions a little bit later in the game, which is perfectly fine, but it can feel overwhelming to be dealing with some adult responsibilities, to have already maybe gone in and out of some different relationships, romantically or friendships, and to now sort of be at a point where you feel like you're starting from square one. It can be incredibly overwhelming getting to know yourself as an adult. And I think another reason that it can sometimes feel overwhelming to speak honestly about how you're feeling and what you've been through is because I think it's common to feel a certain degree of loyalty to your family, to your parents, regardless of what your relationship is to them, because they're your family. And I think for a lot of us, that message was preached where, family is everything. Nothing is more important than family. No matter what happens, family comes first. And I think something that I didn't realize for a long time is that family doesn't just apply to the people that you are blood related to. It does not just apply to the people that you share a name with. I think oftentimes, especially with people who have endured trauma early on in life, chosen family is a very real thing. And you can encounter people in your life in adulthood that haven't been there from the very beginning, and yet you feel so at home with them, like you have so much in common, like you're the same kind of person. There's a camaraderie that no matter how much you might try with your parent or a sibling, someone that you're directly related to, it would never develop, because there are certain fundamental differences that are present. And so that loyalty, I think, sometimes can leave you feeling that speaking honestly about your parent, especially if with that honesty comes revealing some more negative behaviors on their part, it can almost feel like betrayal. And I think this feeling can be intensified when you're dealing with a narcissistic parent. Because for so long, I think for so many of us, we existed as an extension of them. We lived our lives in service to our parent, where we were constantly prioritizing them. We always wanted them to be happy, and we felt like we had to be there for them. And so letting go of that role, I think sometimes, and stepping into your own life can sort of feel inherently wrong in those ways. But it's really important to remember that it's not wrong. And I experienced this also when I was breaking out of my narcissistic family. You're sort of learning to develop that self-trust in very small doses. It makes me feel, or it makes me think of like a baby giraffe. You've got really long legs and you don't really know how to use them yet, but you're trying to stand up. And I think when you have a narcissistic parent and they realize that maybe you're starting to realize how manipulative they are, how unhealthy a lot of their behavior has been, and how poorly they've treated you emotionally for a really long time, imagine that baby giraffe is just being pushed over. That's kind of what it feels like, where they don't want to help you stand up and walk and help you to learn how to use your legs. They want you to continue to fall over. Because if you're able to actually start walking and then running and gaining that independence and start trusting yourself again and figuring out who you are, then that might mean that the jig is up for them. This image that they have worked so hard and for so long to build and maintain might crumble. And these are all the things that come to the surface, at least for me, when I'm in a position where I have to reveal to someone that this person, my parent, who they have met, they have interacted with, and they've formed this opinion of in their heads that was more positive than anything else, is not actually who they think they are. And I have to let them in on some of these uglier truths. You're sort of setting the stage now for this image to be completely destroyed. And I think that can be really threatening for a narcissistic parent, which can sometimes cause their behavior to intensify. They're acting out even further to do anything in their power to prevent you from seeing things for what they truly are. And so they might try to gaslight you into believing that things didn't actually happen the way that you're saying they happened, or that you're remembering it wrong, you're crazy. They might try to convince you that no one will believe you, and that if you try to tell someone that, then they're just going to think worse of you. And so all the while that you're coming to terms with what actually went on throughout your life, you might have this presence, this really influential person in your life trying to silence you over and over and over again, trying to get you to doubt what you know in your heart to be true. You feel it, even though you've suppressed it, you know it's true. I remember telling my husband some of what was going on at home. This was very early on in our relationship, and I still knew nothing at that point about narcissism or mental health. All I knew was that when my husband would be there, my parent would be very friendly, very outgoing, very kind. And then when he would leave, my parent would say some really negative, hurtful things about him. He would tell me lies about him to try to sabotage our relationship. And it was a really negative experience overall. And so I remember feeling like I wanted to let him in on what was going on behind the scenes because I wanted him to know what he was walking into. And being that it was so early in this new, very important relationship in my life, I didn't want to start that off on the wrong foot with any kind of dishonesty. I think one of the things that narcissistic parents and their children, narcissistic families as a whole, I think lack is transparency. It's direct, honest communication. And I think transparency is so important, especially in romantic relationships, that I felt like it was my responsibility to at least divulge what I knew. I didn't know the extent of what was going on. I didn't have a name for a lot of these different behaviors or these tendencies, but I just knew that it was wrong to be one person to someone's face, and then as soon as they leave the room, to completely flip the script and be an entirely different person. To say that you don't like them, or to complain about them, to point out all the negative things that you think they are. I knew that that was wrong. And so I felt like it was my responsibility to share that. And again, I think this is when that image comes into play. I think when you're dealing with a narcissistic parent and maybe an overachieving child, on the surface, to outsiders, everyone outside of the immediate family, I think it can be really easy to perceive that family as the perfect family with, the white picket fence and the dog. It seems like everything is fine, average, maybe even above average. And almost to the point sometimes, I think, where it's unbelievable. They're going on vacations and their kid's in the paper and the parent is the volunteer coach of the softball team. It's all too good to be true sometimes. And, for me, I was completely naive to that. I had no idea how that might be perceived. And I think having lived that experience and been a part of that kind of dynamic, it's definitely opened my eyes to other people and to other families, especially when I encounter a younger person who is mature beyond their years, or they're constantly overachieving. Their parent is overly involved. I think sometimes enduring this kind of emotional abuse, enduring any kind of negative experience, although it is negative, I think sometimes it can open your eyes to things that you didn't know were there before, things that maybe would have slid by completely under the radar, which moving forward can be a real way for you to help other people in your lives moving forward. I think that is sometimes the silver lining when you've gone through something negative, is that you can learn from it. You learn to recognize these things that most people might not ever think to question. In talking about responsibility, right? The responsibility of telling the truth to someone in your life and all of the uncomfortable things, the anxieties that come with making that decision and sitting in that situation. How much do I tell? Am I trauma dumping on this person? Do they really want to hear this? Do they believe me? What's my alternative, right? How do I bypass this question so that we don't have to get into this? Or should we get into this? There's a lot weighing on your mind. I think in talking about responsibilities, if you listened to last week's episode, you know that I celebrated my birthday earlier this month. And on my birthday, I received a message from both my parents individually wishing me a happy birthday. And so you might be wondering, okay, well, what's wrong with that, right? What's wrong with sending a birthday text? How does that even relate to any kind of responsibilities? And I will tell you, the last time that I had any real interaction with my parents was about 10 months ago, right after I got married. And after my wedding, after starting to realize a little bit of my trauma and really have these epiphanies, these realizations about how so much of that had drastically influenced my own personal behavior, that now I have to unlearn and relearn so that I can be a better person, I made the decision to go no contact. And I told my parents that in a letter that I confirmed that they got. They read it. They knew about my decision. Nothing on the holidays. Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year's came and went. But on my birthday, I get a text from both of them. And again, what's wrong with this? What's wrong with this is that in sending that message, not only did they completely disrespect and disregard my boundary, right? Which is, I don't want to speak again until we can sit down and talk about some of these really ugly truths, these things that I experienced throughout my life as a result of your behavior that are now the root of some of the most challenging issues that I have faced and will continue to face for the foreseeable future. I remember feeling when I wrote that letter and I made that decision, like, one, I didn't feel like I was gaining anything from that relationship anymore. And two, I was doing so much work personally to just get myself to a better headspace, to let go a lot of the toxicity that I had been exposed to, that I had mimicked throughout my childhood, to teach myself better, healthier behaviors, all the while trying to let go of hypervigilance and intrusive thoughts and anxiety. I was doing so much personally that I felt like I was doing myself a disservice to continue to try to mend a relationship with people who were not willing to put the work in themselves. And so they disrespected my boundary by reaching out before they were ready to talk, pretending like everything was fine. And they also put the responsibility of maintaining that boundary, of making the decision to answer or not to answer on me. And this, I think, really speaks to that reality that I think a lot of narcissistic parents create for themselves, where their children or anyone who disobeys them, who acts in a way that is not favorable to them, those people become the villains. And so on the surface, again, these actions are so easily camouflaged. It's a birthday text. They're wishing me a happy birthday. I think to most people, especially if you don't know the details of the situation, it seems like a very kind thing to do. And yet, knowing a bit of background, it's not so cut and dry. And I've been in that position. I've been on the other side of that, and I've made both decisions. I've had lasting friendships with people who I thought were going to be in my life forever. And after those relationships fizzled out, their birthday would come up, and I remember the first year after we really stopped talking, reaching out and sending a happy birthday message. Looking back now, I understand why I did that. Sure, I wanted to wish them a happy birthday, but I think on some level, I was also hoping to get some kind of a reaction out of them. I wanted to remind them that I existed. Maybe try to gauge how they were feeling about our relationship. Do we want to start to maybe take steps forward to developing or rekindling this friendship? Is the door open for that? Maybe in doing that, I'm going to put my name back into your head so you can start to think about me again. I think the motive behind those messages was on some level selfish. I think I sent that message for me, because I was hoping to maybe get something positive out of that, to start a conversation, I guess. And then, right, another year passes, and I come to the realization that, okay, if the only communication that we ever have is on your birthday, then it's clear, right, that you don't want to be communicating with me. There's no longer a place for me in your life. And that's a really tough pill to swallow. But it's important as an emotionally mature adult to respect other people's boundaries and to come to terms with the fact that, listen, some people might only be in your life for a time, and that's perfectly okay. You can be really close with someone and then your lives go in different directions, and that's perfectly okay. And if they have made it clear through not only their words but also their actions that there is no longer a place for you, that you are no longer welcome there, that is a responsibility that you have to shoulder. And so that next year, I remember consciously debating and making the decision not to reach out on their birthday because I wasn't sending that message for them. I was sending it for me. And so in taking that step back, I felt like I was respecting their boundary, no matter how hard it was to come to terms with the fact that I may never see or speak to this person again. And so I think having experienced that and lived both sides of it, having some time and being able to reflect on why I made those decisions and how I felt afterwards, it's really clear to me why that birthday message was sent by my parents. They did it for them. Maybe they wanted to rekindle some kind of a relationship. Maybe they wanted to open the door for some conversation without actually addressing the root of the issue. It makes me think of a friend that I had who was in a relationship for about 4 years with a guy, and anytime they talked about their future, it was very uncertain. He didn't know what his plans were. He didn't know if he saw her in his future marriage-wise, even though he knew that she did want to get married at some point down the line, whether it was to him or someone else, marriage was in her future. And yet he wouldn't break up with her. Knowing all of this, he wouldn't break up with her. And so if she wanted to get out of that relationship and into a relationship with someone who actively saw her in his future or in her future, she would have to be the one to break up with him, which I think is very similar because the root of the issue is with him. And yet she has to be the one to do the dirty work, where on the surface, again, she looks like the villain. She broke up with him. But she only did that because he was refusing to take responsibility for his own uncertainty. And it's not a fun position to be in. I think, ignoring a text is rarely fun, especially when it's from your parents, especially when they're wishing you a happy birthday. And so it's easy to feel yourself like you're the bad guy, like you're the villain, like you're doing something wrong by not answering a birthday message from your parents. And yet all you're doing in doing that is maintaining a boundary that you set and communicated to another person that they blatantly disregarded. And so that's just another responsibility that emotionally immature parents put on their children. The responsibility of being perceived as the bad guy, all in an attempt to maintain their boundaries and their own mental peace. It's completely unfair, and it makes me angry sometimes when I think about it and when I talk about it, because I think it's really reminiscent of a lot of our childhoods where we felt like we had to be the more emotionally mature people. We had to be the ones to cater to our parents because they couldn't handle these emotions. They couldn't take responsibility. They needed our assistance and our reassurance. And I think it gets to the point sometimes for a lot of us where we have to draw that line, where I will no longer feel like the bad guy for taking on these responsibilities that are not mine, for shouldering this weight that you should be carrying. I am doing this to break the cycle, to move forward in a healthy way, because I don't want the people in my life that I care about to feel the way that you have made me feel. And it's uncomfortable and it's frustrating, and it happens a lot of times on really happy, memorable days like holidays or birthdays or other days of significance, which is its own thing to navigate. And it's another thing that I think is just completely disregarded by narcissistic parents sometimes. They have such an inability to take that step back, to remove themselves from the situation and to imagine what the other person must be feeling and to act accordingly. And so I want to turn this to you. Have you ever been in a position where someone in your life, where you made the decision to kind of turn the light on for someone in your life and tell them the truth about your narcissistic parent? If you have been, what was that experience like for you? How did you navigate it? How did you feel? This was kind of the first time that I had ever done that with anyone in my life who I wasn't close to, who I saw regularly, who had known me for a long time. And I guess knowing what was going on in my personal life would be an important part to our relationship. This was someone who I hadn't seen in years, that I had only really kept in touch with on social media. And Yet in that moment, I felt compelled to tell the truth. I felt comfortable enough and confident enough to tell the truth. I was very lucky that it was well received. I was reassured and my decisions and emotions were validated, which was incredible. But despite all of that, it was definitely an uncomfortable position to be in. And I think it's one that probably a lot of us find ourselves in. And that was my experience with it. And I would really love to hear yours. So with that, I think I'm going to wrap up this week's episode. Thank you so much to everyone who's been tuning in. If you enjoyed this week's episode, please be sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel on YouTube. If you're listening on Spotify, be sure to leave us a rating. And I will be back next week with another episode of It's Not Normal, the podcast. Bye.